All right, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Tyler McCann. Tyler is the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. CAPI is a national agri-food think tank. It leads policy analysis on emerging agri-food issues, engages stakeholders in dialogue, and advances public policy. Tyler's career includes working for federal ministers, farm groups, industry associations, and agri-food businesses. He operates a beef and goat farm with his wife and kids in Western Quebec. Please give him a very warm Saskatchewan welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to all of the farm groups for the invitation to be here with you today. I am going to try and, I think, take a step up and maybe a step back from some of the presentations earlier where you've gotten to hear some more of the details about it. I think I want to try and offer a bit of a different perspective on the situation that we're in today in Canadian agriculture. And I think that is very relevant to Saskatchewan agriculture as well. I've been thinking a lot lately about Donald Rumsfeld and his saying about there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And when I think about where we are in the world today, I think about that a lot, and I'm going to keep coming back to that in my presentation. There's been a lot said on tariffs, so I'm going to say some things briefly, maybe contradict a little bit about what was said earlier, but then move into the context that those tariffs are taking place in. First thing, it's important to remember that as much as we talk about how this situation is going to cause pain and suffering for the U.S. farmer, that pain and suffering for the U.S. farmer is going to be very different from the impact that the Canadian farmer feels. Bit of a debate about agri-stability lately because of the changes that were announced, but the context of farm support in the United States is so wildly different. And if you look at why farmers are getting money from the government that they are, it tends to be very ad hoc and depending on the situation, is up in the air. And I think we're looking at any pain and suffering caused by the trade war on U.S. farmers will be offset through direct payments. I laugh because Forbes magazine always compares the cost of the U.S. farm bailout to the cost of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, and how in Trump's first term, governments spent more on farmers than they did on that nuclear program. And I think we're back in that same world again, and I think it's a really different context for the situation that Canadian farmers are in. And I'm not sure the solution is necessarily to say we need to match that dollar for dollar, but is important context for the world that we're operating in today. And I think that this is where I'm going to challenge maybe some of what was heard earlier. I think that there's this sense that we don't know why the US government is doing what it's doing. But for all of the talk about how the president says that tariffs are the most beautiful word in the language, and people slough it off as a president being erratic and doing crazy things, we underestimate the ideological underpinning underneath what the US government and the America First movement is doing today. If you have not read Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, and Lighthizer was the US trade representative in the first administration, and I think really helped set us on the path that we're in today, I suggest you buy it, maybe not off Amazon, go to your local library, get a copy of it, and read it, because it helps you understand what's driving the change in US government approach. If you want something that's a little bit denser but shorter, Stephen Murin, who's now the chair of the National Economic Council, or the White House Council of Economic Advisors, wrote this kind of what was referred to as the User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. And he talks in that about changes that they need to make to deliver generational change. And that is generational change that works better for the US, and that's generational change that's going to work worse for us. And so we need to understand that I don't think that the context that we're in goes away when Donald Trump does. I think that there's a chance that the context that we're in today sticks around for a long time. It's also important to understand that how governments around the world have reacted to this is different. Canada has taken, up till now, one of the most aggressive responses in retaliating immediately with dollar-for-dollar responses. Mexico has taken a very different approach. President Sheinbaum has taken more of a wait-and-see approach, has not moved as quickly and as aggressively to match the tariffs dollar for dollar In Europe, we've seen the European Union take one approach versus the United Kingdom taking another. The European Union closer to what we're doing in Canada, the United Kingdom closer to what they're doing in Mexico. The interesting thing is, so far, it hasn't mattered. Whether or not you're taking a hard line or not, the concessions offered by the United States have been the same. What remains to be seen is whether or not there is starting to be a difference with how governments respond, and all of a sudden, those that have been nicer, those that have been slower with their responses, start to get more favor, and we have to wait and see how that unfolds. But ultimately, we are in this world where we should know that the US wants to upend the global trading system. Like, that is the stated cause for what they want to do. We know that Canada's going to suffer a lot more than the United States will. But we don't know a lot of other things. Like, we don't really know why. We can understand the heft for it. We don't get it. We don't know how long this is going to last. What we've seen over the last couple of months is every time tariffs are promised, they're back down, and the scale and shape of them is not what they're originally pointed out to be. We don't know what the future of the USMCA is. We don't know what the best way to negotiate with them is. And ultimately, then, there's this bigger bucket of unknown unknowns where heaven only knows what comes next and what kind of the unintended consequences of it all is going to be. I want to kind of shift gears now to talk about the context that this is all operating in, and I blame some of this on the Western producer. This is a cartoon they had from December 2024 where they say, overall, this is a farmer on Saint Denis, it was a pretty good year, so don't overdo it in 2025. I don't want it going to my head. Well, clearly, 2025 is looking very different than 2024 is, and I don't think that there's any risk that farmers at the end of the year think that it was a pretty fair year too. Last year, CAPI did a survey of people across agriculture and food across the country to ask them, what are the risks that you're worried about? And I want to acknowledge the survey work was supported by the Global Institute for Food Security, and I appreciated that partnership. Stephen, what we heard was at the time, 60%, more than 60% of respondents were either optimistic or very optimistic about the future of Canadian agriculture and food. Earlier this year, we did a survey with Real Agriculture of farmers, and we asked the question, when it comes to the coming production year versus last year, do you feel that there is more optimism or more risk, less risk, or risk is about the same? 68% of people, this was in January, were saying that there was more risk than last year. It's interesting, when you dive into the risk is about the same, I originally saw that number and went, what? How can you think that risk is about the same, given all that we already knew was going to happen by the end of January? But it tended to be farmers that have better marketing plans, that are more thoughtful about the risks that their business faced, that are more comfortable with the risk landscape in the year that lies ahead. And for me, it drives home the point that ultimately, as farmers, your best and first line of defense is always going to be the risk management choices that you're making on the farm. And the more that you think about that, the more comfortable you'll be with the risk landscape that we're in. But underneath those risks, we're in a space where the fundamentals of Canadian agriculture are changing. We are farming less land in Canada today than we have in the last 100 years. Our land use is actually going down. Our export growth is slowing. At the top, the blue line is the value of our exports. The green line is the quantity of our exports. We really got really excited when Canada exported $100 billion worth of agriculture and agri-food products. But that masks the fact that our growth in the quantity of ag and food products has slowed, and so much of the value increase happened since 2021, when COVID and a Russian invasion of Ukraine upended global commodity prices. And the reality is that there's something to be said that Vladimir Putin has done more to increase the value of Canadian agriculture exports than anything the government of Canada has done over the last 20 years. Like, it's this unfortunate reality that we're in, where it is this external shock has really changed the system. R&D investment is declining. These are business R&D numbers. Public R&D spending in Canada is staying relatively stable. When you adjust it for inflation, it's going down too. But we're struggling to get the private sector investment, and we need to do a better job on the R&D landscape. We are becoming a more primary agriculture-driven sector. One of the best diversification strategies we've got in Canadian agriculture is that we add more value at home domestically. But if you look at agriculture and agri-food, the agri-food share of the sector is taking up a smaller slice of the puzzle than it did over the last 20 years. We are in the space where we are more reliant on primary agriculture to drive the growth in the sector. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a riskier thing in the world that we're in today. And so in our risk survey, we asked people, what are the three things that are, or we asked people, what are a list of 30 things, what are the three things that were top of mind? Three things stood out: the policy and regulatory environment, extreme weather, and trade barriers and protectionism. Unfortunately, none of this surprised any of us, because we know that these are the issues that we struggle with, and yet we struggle to meaningfully deal with them. And when we dive a level deeper, we asked, how confident are you that the policy framework will effectively reduce or mitigate each of these risks? And it is a bit mind-boggling for me, and my career's been in and around ag policy in Ottawa, that actually we're more confident in our ability to manage and mitigate extreme weather than we are in our ability to manage and mitigate policy risk. Policy risk is entirely man-made. This is something that somebody in Ottawa or Regina or in capitals across the country are making decisions that are creating the situation that we're in, and yet we feel that we don't have the confidence that we need to manage it or to deal with it. And so we kind of took the survey results, we did some dialogues, and what we came up with is the sense that we need to move from optimism. If you go back to that, more than 60% of people last year saying that they're optimistic about the future, to being more realistic. We need to understand that this, and this is a quote from a participant in a dialogue, continuing to putter along is going to be devastating. And this was before Donald Trump came in and upended the global trading system. And so two things that we heard people agree to was that we need a meaningful national agriculture policy framework, and we need to realize the opportunities to drive growth and sustainability for the sector. And as part of that national policy framework, we need a cohesive approach to risk management, which accounts for the realities of the rapidly changing environment and our capacity and limitations in addressing threats. Again, this was all before we entered the trade war that we're in. And I will say that, again, when we talk on that first point about a national agriculture policy framework, we don't mean a federal policy framework. The provinces are there. They are incredibly important players at the table. We need the feds and the provinces working better together than they are today. And so when I think about the Canadian ag context that we're in, the things that I think are the known unknowns is the fundamentals are changing, and they're not changing in a good way. Our confidence to manage risks is lacking, and we need more sector leadership. But what we don't know is, what does it really take for change? One of the things that we struggle with is that we've known for a long time what we need to do to make things better, and yet we struggle to actually make that happen. And we struggle to figure out, how do we increase collaboration? I do think it's good at events like this, where you've got multiple different groups coming together to work together. We absolutely need to see more of that today than we have in the past. I think it came up earlier in the presentation on government relations. You are all absolutely stronger together. And I know that that's tough because you don't always agree on things, but finding ways to work together is absolutely essential to the success of dealing with this crazy, risky environment that we're in. But we don't know what else is coming. We don't know what else is coming from the policy landscape. We don't know what else is coming in the trading landscape, and it's a challenge to figure out, what does the future look like in that context. So I want to end with some thoughts around what we can do, and I like that this cartoon that says we're now leaving the status quo. Well, I would argue that the status quo left us a long time ago, and what we're doing is trying to play catch up and thinking through what that means and what that looks like. In our risk report survey last year, we asked people, what do you think the priorities for the public sector should be, and what do you think the priorities for the private sector should be? I like to point out that R&D and innovation is the one thing that was on both of those lists. Clearly, that's something that we should all be able to agree on and do a better job of. But I think that this gives a pretty straightforward census to the things that matter. And again, they're not terribly surprising. We need to deal with trade policy and advocacy. We need to deal with climate change adaptation. We need governments to invest more and do more on R&D and innovation. We need a more competitive tax landscape, and we need a better domestic regulatory environment. Like, that is not earth-shattering, but yet we've struggled to get action on this in a meaningful way. That coherent policy agenda is needed more now than it has ever been needed before because of the risk landscape that we're in. And so we, as part of our risk report, tried to identify 4 key takeaways. Governments should do less, but do it better. I think that there's a strong argument to be made that governments have been doing too much and not been doing a great job of all that they're doing. So let's identify what governments really need to do and make sure that we hold their feet to the fire so they do it well. We need to find ways for the sector to better collaborate, not just compete. We need to get clearer roles between governments and others in the sector. Where are those expectations for what we want government to do, but where's the farmers and other private sector leaders going to show their leadership? And we need this sense of what clear, measurable, realistic goals are. And I always feel like I need to point out that I'm not talking about the next fertilizer reduction target. I think that that has done kind of irreparable harm to the idea of targets in the sector, but what they should do is tell us where we're going, how far away that is, how aggressive the work is that's needed to get there, and the commitment that's needed from governments and others. But we need to do these things together so that we're all on the same page about where we're going. But a big thing, and Tracy Broaden, I give her credit for helping me kind of think through this. There's this quote from Einstein about, if I had an hour to solve the world's problems, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem. So I want to end with defining some of these problems. On the policy and regulatory environment, we have governments that don't work as well as they used to. I like to show this chart around Ag Canada employees. The big growth in Ag Canada employees has been in internal services. I'm not sure that that's a great success story for the federal government, but we need to find ways to work better with government so that they can deliver more. I think that that change is coming, right? The reality is both of the leading candidates for Prime Minister today are effectively committing to spend less. We know that this change is coming, but what does that mean in the ag context? There's also this quote from Churchill that I like about not letting a crisis go to waste. And so we put out about a month ago our kind of short list of things that we would do, 5 short-term, 5 medium-term, 5 long-term actions we think people could do to respond to the tariff crisis. Ultimately, a lot of it comes down to we need to get our house in order. I think too much we've been caught up around what can we do in Washington to minimize the impact. And my question is, what can we do in Ottawa and Regina and other capitals across the country to better mitigate the impact of these tariffs and reduce the likelihood that they have significant existential consequences for Canadian agriculture and food? And I think that increasingly leads me to think that what we really need is generational change in agriculture policy. The reality is that the ag policy framework that was a significant accomplishment 25 years ago, a generation ago, hasn't changed and kept pace with the world that has changed too. We don't really know what the outcomes we want out of ag policy are in this country. We have had this everything for everyone approach. We've had the luxury of being able to try and do it all in ways that doesn't make tough choices around what our priorities are. And in the meantime, while this has all been going on, farmers, farm businesses, and their value chains they operate in have changed drastically. So the question becomes, what is the ag policy of tomorrow? How do we find a way to better reflect the new practical and political realities that we're in? How do we think longer term? I'll go back to that R&D challenge. We effectively operate in 5-year terms, but R&D is not a 5-year solution. How do we think about ways or trade diversification? Trade diversification will not be solved in 5-year increments. We need to do a better job thinking longer term, but we also need to be more adaptable. We don't change that policy framework until the 5-year negotiation comes up, and we can't think differently unless we figure out how to do that in different ways. And I think ultimately, especially in this era of tightening budgets, we need to think about effectiveness and impact. So it's not just about how much money we're spending, but how are we spending that money and what results are we getting out of it? And that's not always an easy conversation to have, but it is incredibly important. And in a world where we're all really concerned about how are we going to pay the bills we need to pay this year in the face of a trade war, we also need to think about proactive solutions. It can't just be about reactive and dealing with the pressures that we're in. And so ultimately, again, when I think about what we need to do, first and foremost is we need to get on and do things. Like so much of the challenge in ag policy has been, we know what the solutions are. You know, for 20 years that I've been around, like the solutions largely have been the same. But we know we're in a world today where the ag policy framework is not delivering the results where it should be. We are gearing up for negotiations starting for our next policy framework in 2 years. Governments are going to be turning their attention to this. So this is an opportunity for us to use that process to think different. We need to do a better job building sector consensus, but we know that building consensus on change is hard. consensus in this room is going to be difficult, let alone consensus that lines up with the view of farmers in Western Quebec, where I'm from, but we need to figure out how do we do that in a better way, and we need to find the better balance between short-term stability that we need versus the long-term revitalization that will help Canadian agriculture grow at the end of the day. But we don't really know what generational change means. I can tell you what generational change means for me, but that's really pointless. What we need to figure out is what does generational change mean for all of us? And we need to know kind of where governments stand and what they're willing to do and how much leadership are they prepared to show. And then once we know better where governments stand, we can figure out what the industry needs to do at the end of the day. But ultimately, we don't know what the future holds, and that is a challenge. And so what I want to end with is an ask for you all to take time to fill out our 2025 Agri-Food Risk Survey. There's a QR code you can scan with your phone. Come see me after. I'll happy to share the link with you as well. So much of the work that we do is better because it reflects the perspectives of people across the country. We try and do that through survey work. We try and do that through dialogues and engagement and other outreach. But please do let us know your views, so it's not just my perspective that I'm sharing, but the perspective of stakeholders across Canada and across agriculture and food. So with that, I would be happy to take questions for a couple of minutes. Feel free to ask tough questions. I like those the best.
Okay, I'm Toby, Chair of Sassport. So I've been on a few advisory committees with the government. So you're asking what we can do. Well, I'm going to ask you how we can get it done.
Yeah.
How come there's no government people, or very few of them, at this summit right now? People that are in the possession of government to make the decision to say yay or nay.
Yeah, I think that that's a challenge. And one of the interesting dynamics in politics, and kind of we went through this whenever I was a political staffer and we were going through cost cutting 15 years ago, is that one of the easiest things for governments to cut is government travel budgets. And far too often, kind of people applaud whenever travel budgets are cut. But I think that that's the worst thing to cut, because what we need is more people in government spending more time out of Ottawa, out of Regina, at events like this, talking to people like you, understanding the world that you live in. And so I think that there's really a strong encouragement to say that we need to better prioritize not just engagement with elected officials, but engagement with the officials that do the work every day in departments across the country. And I know that there is, I think I heard an NDP member of the legislature that's here. I think we need to acknowledge and support that. I see Penny, and I'll call her out as someone from the government of Saskatchewan Ag Department that's here. So there are some that make an effort. We need to encourage that and support that. But ultimately, I think that there is, and this goes back to some of that GR position earlier, if we really want to drive change, we need to do better with a coherent message across agriculture. One of the dynamics that exists in government is that outside of the agriculture department, everybody talks about agriculture as agriculture. We don't talk about agriculture as agriculture. We talk about it as pork or grains in Saskatchewan or Quebec. But if we want to have success, I think we need to do a better job matching government where government is at. And that means talking as agriculture as often as we can. And I do think that's something that we struggled with. And I think that that will help us get more success at the end of the day. But I also think we need to encourage governments to send more of their people to events like this.
Tyler, when you're talking about substantive change, if you get the impression that a lot of the decisions around agriculture and food policy are actually driven by the Prime Minister's office, which really means that there's going to be a 25-year-old MBA in the office who's going to make a decision that would vexing decision that's sweeping change for those of us in the sector. How much are we really going to accomplish if you've got a political marketing machine out there where people are constantly running for office, and the Prime Minister's office is going to make all these calls, and the ministers are just figureheads?
So I always challenge a bit of this perception again. So I spent the first kind of 9 years of my career working in a minister's office. I was younger than 25 when I started, and so I was one of those kind of boys in shorts pants making decisions that probably should not have been making given the kind of the experience that I had. But I think that we do overplay at times the powers of the Prime Minister's office. Now I'm going to put a big caveat on that, especially over the last 10 years, but in the government before that, when Harper was the Prime Minister, big decisions are absolutely made and controlled by the Prime Minister. That is the way that government worked. That started under Trudeau, that became even worse. But there's a lot of decisions that aren't big decisions that could be made, and it's easier to get them made if the industry is coming and saying, this is what we want. And so I don't think that generational change needs to be a painful thing that the sector goes through. I think big change, generational change, can be something that the sector puts its hand up and says, look, this is what we're looking for and this is what we want at the end of the day. And I think, Al, when we do that, it makes it a lot easier for ministers across the country, for the ministers that sit around the FBT table to make the decisions that they want. And so I'm not calling for kind of radical reform that's going to blow agriculture up and where you would need the Prime Minister to kind of get engaged because it's going to consume the government. But what are kind of the meaningful, substantial things that we can do to make agriculture policy in this country better? And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for ag ministers that want to show leadership. And I expect that regardless of who wins the next government, we will have an ag minister that wants to show more leadership than what we've seen over the last couple of years. I think that there's a real opportunity to do those things differently. So yes, kind of big transformational change or big spendings of billions of dollars, you need to get the Prime Minister's office to buy into. But I don't think that that's what's needed to deliver generational change in this country. And I think if we have a clear sense of what we want and where we want it to go, we can do that without worrying about where the Prime Minister's office stands.
Awesome. Thank you very much.